Today, we're diving into something, well, something pretty wild. It's a theological framework that takes everything you think you know about the end of the world and flips it completely on its head. This is a big one, so let's just jump right in. So let's just start with a huge question right out of the gate. What if the book of Revelation, with all its prophecies and warnings about the end times, what if it's not about the future at all? What if the story it's telling has already happened? First, let's get on the same page about the version of the apocalypse that we all know. You know, the one from movies and pop culture, full of dragons, cosmic battles, and this huge, dramatic end of the world. Yeah, the traditional reading, the one most of us were taught, treats Revelation like a book of secret codes. It's all about the end of time, a final judgment day that's still way off in the future. All those crazy figures, the dragons, the beasts, all the weird numbers, we're told they're symbols. They represent empires or political leaders or these big abstract ideas about good versus evil. Okay, but the framework we're digging into today asks us to just set all of that aside. It says, what if the apocalypse isn't symbolic at all? What if it's not a metaphor? Instead, what if we're supposed to read it as a straightforward historical document describing things that have already come to pass? This new way of looking at things is called impact theology, and believe me, it really changes how you see every single part of the text, starting with its most basic purpose. So what is impact theology? Well, to put it simply, it's a framework that says we should read the apocalypse literally, but as a historical account, not a future prediction. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? Why would someone write such an important message in a code so complicated that almost nobody for 2,000 years could understand it? This framework says they didn't. And when you put the two views side by side, the difference is just stark. The traditional view sees symbols pointing to the future. Impact theology sees concrete history describing the past. It even shifts the source text we should focus on, saying we should prioritize the Greek Septuagint, the common Greek translation of the scriptures used back then, over the Hebrew text that came later. Now, once you make that pivot from future symbol to past history, it immediately forces a really startling question. If this is a historical account, who's the one actually having the vision? Who is the protagonist of this story? And the answer, according to this framework, isn't who you'd expect. It's not the Apostle John, the traditional author. No, it's someone else entirely. Someone who's been hiding in plain sight this whole time. Okay, get ready for this, because this is the first major bombshell of this whole idea. The source material says it directly. The central figure, the one actually on the island of Patmos having this vision, is John the Baptist. This changes everything. In this view, the apocalypse is John the Baptist's vision of events that happened before Jesus even started his public ministry. He's the faithful and true horseman, the one preparing the way. This framework even argues that John had his own death and resurrection experience on Patmos, which is what gave him the authority for a baptism of resurrection. He's even the one described as being similar to the Son of Man. So think about it. If the main character is John the Baptist, and the events are real history, then the whole timeline for the end times gets yanked out of the distant future and dropped right into the past. This change in who's telling the story creates a totally different timeline. The apocalypse stops being about the end of the world and starts being about the end of an age that is already long gone. So here's how this framework lays it all out. It starts way back with the Septuagint translation setting the stage. Then, the apocalyptic events all happen in this really short, specific window of history, from the announcement of John's birth, through his ministry and resurrection, then Christ's death and resurrection, and finally, this period called the parousia. And this next part is absolutely critical. The word for Christ's return is parousia. In Greek, that word just means presence. Impact theology says this wasn't a promise about the future. It was a description of a present reality. It was that historical period after the resurrection when Christ was physically present, appearing to his followers. In other words, the second coming has already happened. Okay, so this brings us to the biggest and most profound question of all. If all these epic events from Revelation, the judgment, the return, the whole shebang, are all historical events that are over and done with, what was the point? What did it all accomplish? And the answer is right there in the title of this explainer. The whole point wasn't to destroy the world, but to bring in a completely new reality through what this framework calls an annihilating glory. To really get this, you have to compare two totally different ways of relating to God. First, there's what this framework calls the Jehovahsic relationship. From the Old Testament name for God, Jehovah, it's all based on law and prophecy. That system defines humanity by its inability to keep the law, by sin, and it all leads to judgment. But Christ's new pact? It's completely different. It's based on his resurrection, and it doesn't just deal with sin, it ends the entire category of sin itself. And this is the absolute core of the whole thing, the central thesis. Christ's death wasn't just another sacrifice for sin inside that old system. No, it was the event that completely terminated that system. It was the end of sin as a theological concept defined by that old law. It wasn't a payment, it was a cancellation. So this totally reframes that famous parable of the sheep and the goats. It's not about separating good people from bad people at the end of time. The goats represent the old system of animal sacrifice that the law required. The sheep represent Christ, the Lamb of God. The judgment, which this framework says happened at the resurrection, was the final decisive separation of humanity from that old sacrificial system. The judgment is over. And the consequences of this idea are just immense. The old covenant of law? It's fulfilled, it's over, it's terminated. The theological concept of sin that was tied to that law, it's effectively erased. Humans are no longer born under this legal charge of sin. We make mistakes, we have faults, sure, but that fundamental status is gone. And this leads to the biggest conclusion of all. Universal salvation is now the default reality for every human being. When you really step back and look at it, impact theology isn't just some academic exercise in rereading an old book. It's a complete reframing of the human condition, our relationship with God, and the very nature of what we call right and wrong. And that leaves us with one last massive question to chew on. If the great theological judgment is already over, if that old system of sin and sacrifice has been completely annihilated, what does that mean for us, right here, right now? What does it even mean to do wrong in a world that has, in a theological sense, already been saved?